This lecture is going to cover some basic introductory chemistry to help you better understand upcoming chapters. This lecture covers essentially what is in your textbook in Chapter 2, an introduction to chemistry. So you are composed of matter, and matter is composed of elements, and an element, as we see in the text, is a substance that cannot be broken down into other substances by chemical reactions. Now those elements can join together in different ways to form compounds when you have two or more elements stuck together in different ways. And you have emergent properties in those compounds. You have properties in the compounds that you didn't see in the elements. So as we build complexity, we see new properties arising. For life on Earth, there are a few elements that are incredibly important. Carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, and nitrogen make up 96% of living matter. So those are very, very, very important. Now, other elements can be important as well, like calcium and phosphorus, etc. They're super important, but they're not required in the same quantities as carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, and nitrogen. So these elements down here are referred to as trace elements, whereas the elements that compose 96% of matter are known as essential elements. Now, if we look at the building blocks of these elements, they are composed of atoms. And atoms have a nucleus that generally consists of positive protons and neutral neutrons, surrounded by a cloud of electrons. We often draw them in these shells, these energy shells. This gives you an idea of the amount of potential energy in those electrons. And those electrons kind of move around at random, so that's why it's shown as kind of a glow here. You don't know where the electron actually is within that cloud, but it could be anywhere. And that is how you get an atom. Now, generally speaking, the number of electrons equal the number of protons, except for in ions, as you may know. If you have a negative ion, you have more electrons than you have protons, for example. As I said, where those electrons are located, which energy shell they're in, has to do with how much potential energy is in that electron. The closer electrons are to the nucleus, the least amount of energy they have. If they're energized and have more energy, they can be found in outer electron shells. And so as chemical reactions take place and the electrons change position, they will absorb or release energy. And that becomes imperative for understanding things like how ATP releases energy. When bonds break and energy levels change in those electrons, they fall towards the nucleus of one of the components of that are produced in that reaction, energy is released. So if we look at the periodic table of elements, this is just a snippet of the periodic table. We can see, for example, one of the simplest atoms to study, hydrogen, which has one electron and one proton, basically, and that's all it is. And here we have helium. Helium has two electrons. And notice it has an atomic number and an atomic mass. So we can look at the atomic number. That tells us how many protons are in the nucleus. Therefore, we know that there would also be two electrons surrounding that nucleus. When you look at the atomic mass, just round it to the nearest whole number and subtract out the atomic number, and you'll know how many neutrons are also found in that nucleus. If you've ever heard of an isotope, a radioactive isotope, those are atoms that have different numbers of neutrons than the typical atom of that element. Okay, so let's just look at a few of these. I just want to show you one important concept. The first energy level, closest to the nucleus, generally only contains one or two, up to two electrons. The other energy shells that we'll discuss in Bio 1 can hold 8 electrons. And if that outer level, what we call the valence shell or the valence level, if it does not contain 8 electrons, then that element tends to be reactive, and it will react to other things, either stealing electrons or borrowing electrons to reach that octet, that 8 electrons. That's our magic number for now, right? That's the when the outer level is completely full and everything's nice and stable. So we'll see that some chemicals like sulfur, for example, can ignite. They don't have 8 electrons, but it can react with oxygen to gain electrons or to share electrons, and it can react quite violently in that case. But something like argon or neon, what we call a noble gas, tend to have a full outer shell, and they are non-reactive. So when we have chemical reactions occur, what we're doing is we're breaking bonds, or we're forming new chemical bonds. We'll talk about some of those bonds, especially covalent bonds, here in a moment. So when we have a chemical reaction, we have reactants and products. Reactants are the original molecules. Products are the molecules that we get at the end of the reaction. So for example, in this reaction, we have H2O and CO2 reacting together, so water and carbon dioxide, and when that reaction is over with, we have, in this case, we have glucose, and we have oxygen gas produced. Or it could go the other direction. We can break down glucose. This is what we do every day when we eat breakfast, right? You break down sugar and you release carbon dioxide gas. So the reactants are what you start with, the products are what you end with. And sometimes reactions are reversible. Well, most of the time, in some way, they are often reversible. It may require energy in some cases to reverse the reaction, but we'll talk a little bit more about that when we talk about energy. So here's an example of a very simple reaction. Here we have H2, which is molecular hydrogen. So here's one hydrogen atom, here's another. They're stuck together via covalent bonds, meaning they're sharing electrons. Here's O2, or molecular oxygen. They're stuck together with 2 covalent bonds. And if you have a reaction take place, we break some of these bonds and we glue things together in different ways. We form new covalent bonds. So we break some of the existing bonds, we form new bonds. Electrons change position. In this case, they're drawn closer to the nucleus of that oxygen. That means the electrons have given up energy because they're closer to a nucleus. They've released energy. So this reaction, producing water, would actually produce a lot of heat. If you light hydrogen on fire, that's the reaction that you see here. It would produce a lot of heat. We would call that an exothermic reaction, meaning it gives off a lot of energy. Now, the speed at which a chemical reaction takes place is going to vary based on the temperature. So is it taking place in a refrigerator? Is it taking place in an oven? Is it taking place, at a Bunsen burner? The concentration of reactants and products will affect the rate of the reaction, because these things are usually floating around, let's say, in water, and they're bumping into each other. And the more of them there are, the more often they collide and react. And then, as we'll learn later, the presence of a catalyst in biology, that's usually an enzyme, will tend to increase the rate of the chemical reaction. And that's really important, because as a living thing, we need to have reactions take place in a reasonable amount of time. So I want to touch briefly on some of the different chemical bonds that we can form. We'll start with 2 of the weaker ones. One of them is what we see here. Now, let's look at what's actually happening before we talk about it in greater detail. So here is sodium. It has 2 electrons in that inner energy shell. And then we see 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 in the next shell, and only 1 in the outer shell. So that's an unstable situation. Here's chlorine. It is missing 1 in its outer energy shell. So it only has 7. So what happens in this case, this electron is stripped off of sodium and it goes to chlorine. Now that is going to create an ionic situation. Why? Because in this example here, the number of protons in the sodium nucleus is the same as the number of electrons. Protons are positive, electrons are negative. However, when we remove an electron, we now have 1 fewer electron than we had before. So we have more protons than we have electrons. That gives this ion an overall positive charge. That's known as a cation. We've gained an electron here, so we have an overall negative charge. We now call this a chloride ion. So now they have opposite charges. And as you probably know, opposite charges attract each other. So here we have sodium and chloride, and we can form sodium chloride, or NaCl, when these two attract one another. They attract to one another and they form a very specific shape that forms into a crystal as they're all stuck together. But this crystal is not terribly strong. In order to dissolve this crystal, you just have to drop it into water. So it's not a real strong bond. But it is an important one. Another example of a weak bond, this one's even weaker than the last one we saw, is a hydrogen bond. And we'll talk more about hydrogen bonds later, but hydrogen bonds occur between two molecules. And what happens is, because oxygen and hydrogen do not share electrons equally, so this hydrogen and this oxygen are covalently bonded together. Oxygen borrows the electrons from hydrogen more frequently than it shares them with hydrogen. That gives oxygen a partial negative charge. That's what this symbol means. It's partially negative. And that makes hydrogen partially positive because its electrons are gone more often. And so it's a weak charge. So therefore, the same thing's happening down here in ammonia. So this ammonia molecule has positive ends near the hydrogens and a negative end near this nitrogen. So the slightly negative nitrogen and the slightly positive hydrogen are attracted to each other, kind of like an ionic bond, except in this case it's not due to electrons being stolen, it's due to the unequal sharing of electrons within this oxygen and within this ammonia that creates a slight charge on the ends here, and therefore they're attracted to each other. The negative nitrogen and the positive hydrogen have a slight attraction. Now this is a very weak bond. It can break and reform, and we'll talk more about it when we talk about water. So here's a water molecule. Once again, this is important to remember that the hydrogens and the oxygen within a water molecule are sharing electrons, but they share them unequally, and that gives them that slight charge. So when we have a covalent bond, once again, hydrogen has one atom normally, and oxygen will have 6 electrons in its outer shell. So hydrogen has 1 electron, oxygen has 6 electrons in its outer shell, and therefore it needs 2 more to be full, and hydrogen needs 1 more to be full because it's just that first energy level. So they share an electron with hydrogen, and that's how they get stuck together. They're sharing electrons. They're both happy, but oxygen borrows electrons more frequently than it shares them, which makes oxygen slightly negative in this relationship. So what we have are here's an example of how we would form H2. We have 2 hydrogen atoms. They each, I'm going to say they would each prefer, they're not sentient, they don't, prefer anything, but they both have affinities for an extra electron, and they then share those electrons, forming H2, which is now you have two of the same element stuck together in that case. We can also share electrons in more complex ways. In this case, 2 oxygens stick together to form molecular oxygen, which is O2. And here we have a double bond. They're sharing 2 sets of electrons with each other. You can see that drawn here in a dot structure as well as with lines. And here's what it would look like if you drew out those shared electrons. So each oxygen is giving the other one, I shouldn't say give, but is sharing 2 electrons with the other oxygen. And that's how molecular oxygen forms. So this is really strong. The more covalent bonds you have, the stronger that bond is. And as we'll see, this actually moves on to another chapter, but I just want to mention that another important molecule we'll be talking about are organic molecules, and hydrocarbons are the foundation of the study of those organic molecules, and that's when you have a lot of carbons stuck together as well as some hydrogens. That's why they're called hydrocarbons. And the reason they are so useful for living things is that they can vary a lot in their properties. And as we'll learn, structure and function are tied together intimately in chemistry and biology. So the structure of these molecules, even though they have a lot of the same parts, they're very different when you put them together in different ways. So hydrocarbons can vary in the length of the carbon backbone and the number of double bonds and how branched they are and whether or not they form rings. Those are ways they can vary, and that gives them different properties. So you're going to end up with things like amino acids and proteins, which are very different from things like lipids or fats. It's just because things are put together in different ways. And then you may attach some extra components to those backbones that give them even more varied properties, as we'll see. And now one thing I want to mention here is hydrocarbons, as you may know, when you pour oil into water, they do not interact. We know that water has a charge. We saw that in the last slide. Water is charged because of the unequal sharing of electrons. Now, there is a measurement of how much affinity various atoms have for electrons. So you can think of it as how much do they like electrons. And notice oxygen has a very high electronegativity. Oxygen's 3.5, whereas hydrogen is 2.1. It's less. So when you put an oxygen and a hydrogen together, they share electrons, but they hang out with oxygen more often because it has a higher electronegativity. Okay? But in the molecules we're talking about here, hydrocarbons, we're talking about carbon and hydrogen, and they have pretty similar electronegativities. So they share electrons equally. That means there is no charge. So they do not mix with water very well. These non-polar substances, things without a charge, do not mix well with polar substances like water. Now, if you have something like oxygen, like we saw before, stuck to itself, they have the same electronegativity. So an oxygen stuck to an oxygen would also have no charge. It would be sharing electrons equally with another oxygen. So we stick these things together, carbons and hydrogens, and they have about the same electronegativity, so they have no real charge. And as we can see, you can change the length of the carbon backbone that's stuck together, and that changes the properties, and we have different names for each of those chemicals. Here's ethane or propane. You stick double bonds into those chains, which gives them different properties, and you can change the position of that double bond, so where is it found. You can have a branch. So notice what's really interesting about these two, about butane and isobutane, is that they each have the same number of carbons and hydrogens, but they're stuck together in different ways. This one has a branch to it, this one does not. Or you can take one of these carbon chains and loop it around to itself and form a ring. And now you have, in this case, cyclohexane, and in the other case, so you have benzene with a lot of double bonds in it. So these are different ways to make these hydrocarbons. So as we'll see in the organic chemistry chapter, you can then stick other things onto these carbon backbones that give them new properties. You can put a phosphate group on there, or you can put any number of functional groups on there that changes the properties. You can actually make one of these chains polar, so it will interact with water, but you have to stick the right functional group on it to do that. So just a reminder, covalent bonds are going to form based on the number of electrons in that outer shell, that valence shell. And this is telling you how many electrons each of these things needs to have a full octet. So carbon needs 4. That's quite a few, right? It needs 4. And therefore it can bond to all kinds of different things to fill that outer valence shell. And it can bond with other carbons, it can bond with other molecules like hydrogen, or other atoms like hydrogen, and things like I said, like other functional groups. And because it has 4 empty spots, it can bond with lots of things in lots of ways, and that's why it is the building block of all biochemistry, right? It's the building block of life. We are carbon-based life forms because it forms so many different bonds in so many different ways with so many different things. All of organic chemistry is really based on how carbon sticks to things. You can think of carbon as the Legos of life. They stick together in different ways to build lots of new things. And as I said, we need to remember that carbon and hydrogen form the backbone of organic chemistry, but they have equal electronegativity, and therefore they're not going to really mix well with water. But as we'll see in the next chapter, when we get to organic chemistry, when you start sticking functional groups on here, we can change the properties of certain organic molecules, and some of them will mix with water. So certain amino acids are hydrophilic, meaning they like water. Some of them are hydrophobic because of the way they're put together. They are repelled by water. Lipids are mostly not water soluble. They are repelled by water. So we'll see how that all works and comes together, how those emergent properties arise based on the chemistry of the molecules involved in future chapters. All right, that's enough basic chemistry. Read through this chapter. It's really important. You also have an active learning guide with questions from these chapters. This is basic stuff that most of it you should hopefully have carried with you from high school chemistry or any college chemistry you've had. But it's imperative to have this basic foundation to understand everything else we're going to build on in Bio 1.